All right, good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Thank you for being here tonight, and I hope you've had a good week and things are going fairly well for you. As we begin tonight to talk about, well, some years that maybe some of you will remember. I am teasing, yes. Let's begin by praying, first of all, for who? Forgiveness, for sure. Always forgiveness and patience and tolerance and all those good things. So I think would all of you agree, and and I read all your papers, and most of you, this is what you wrote on your paper. Some of you pointed to specific things like the Crusades or certain people or monasticism or whatever as being important for you. But almost everybody said, we see these cycles over and over again. We see the swing to the extremes. We see people who pull us back to center or try to, at least for a while. And how human the church is. But at the same time, that the fact that it has somehow survived for 2,000 years and is both the oldest and still the largest institution in the world tells me at least that God is involved here. God is somehow keeping it going and directing it. At least some people are actually listening to where we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to be doing, right? Where we're supposed to be going. And that happens over in every single age. So right now, you look at what's going on in the world right now. What are we supposed to be doing as church? How do we respond? How are we supposed to be behaving? Okay? And of course, for us today, that's one of the roles of the Pope, to help interpret and give us some direction. That's what we see as the Pope doing. But hopefully, as you've also learned, that wasn't always the case, right?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And tonight, especially, we're going to start to talk about, more specifically, how did the Pope get into that role and what happened in between. So when we left off last time, we have been talking about the Reformations. What were the three Reformations? Catholic, Protestant, Radical Reformation. Right, the Radical Reformation. Three different Reformations that really shook the church. I've often thought that even though Martin Luther will never be named a saint in the Catholic Church, perhaps in some ways he should be, because he really forced them to sit up and take notice and to realize that change had to happen. And of course, he probably wouldn't have wanted that anyways, but he was definitely a prophetic figure who paid for it. So, because of the Reformations, the three Reformations, Christianity, European Christianity, which had previous to this been totally Catholic, totally part of the Holy Roman Empire, was just shattered, right? And as we talked about last week, some of the nation states, Spain, Italy, Ireland, were very much Catholic still. Some France was kind of half and half. England, Scotland, Switzerland, Netherlands were Calvinist or Reformed. Germany, Scandinavia were Lutheran. All this splitting and competing resulted in some major wars. Because, why? Why were they fighting?
Because God was on their side.
Okay, God was on their side. They wanted to be top dog. Okay.
Yeah, top dog.
Top dog. Was that all there was?
Well, some of the states, they had to be part of a religion if they wanted to live there.
Right.
The Huguenots fought because they didn't like that.
Right. Why did they have to be part of that religion?
Because it was a state mandated religion.
Okay. Why?
Money.
Well, partly money.
Had to do with the
Mine's always
head.
partly money.
Did it start because of the vacuum in Italy and the church had to step in terms of and create a power
not
base?
yet,
and
not
everything?
yet, not yet.
That's way back?
It
Okay.
depended on the leaders, wasn't it, who was the top dog in the state that
Yes.
determined?
Which religion
Yeah.
they were.
There wasn't
Because
freedom of religion.
there was no freedom of religion, and they did not believe that
That
they
there should
could have multiple religions in one area.
Yeah.
Okay? They did not believe that religious pluralism could exist. So,
Well, it never had before.
it never had before.
So how could that be?
Absolutely correct. We had always been Catholic in Europe. You know, other places had always been Hindu or whatever, or pagan.
You either were or you weren't.
You either
Yeah.
were or you weren't, yeah. Okay, so religious pluralism was a totally foreign concept. Religious freedom, totally foreign concept. One of the things that the Reformation also fueled, we heard in the video last week that it fueled the middle class, the growth of the middle class, okay? Urbanization along with the Crusades. And colonization. You know, people got tired of being in the middle of war, and so they took off. I would also point out that you've heard of the Spanish Inquisition. Okay, it was going on at the same time. So that's how Spain was dealing with anybody who was not Catholic. That's true, that's true. And Spain and Portugal both had extremely Catholic rulers who just simply were not going to put up with any disruption in that. So here's a map of some of the, and I know you all saw this back when you were in elementary school, if not later. Some of the voyages taken in the years by various explorers. Here's Columbus here, 1492, right? There's Cabot in 1497 up here, okay? And then, of course, down around Africa and to the Far East and all. So they were going everywhere. And it's mostly the Spanish, the Portuguese, some Dutch, you know, some British, some French, but mostly the Spanish and the Portuguese, as they said.
They said it was the invention of the three-mast ship.
Yes.
Before that, they wouldn't dare go that far.
Right. It was recommended to me that perhaps you would like to see this. I did find it, Joanne.
Oh, good.
This is a short video, and I'll try to remember to send you this separately. But since we're talking about the wars of religion and all these changes in Europe and how you can't separate the church history from the political history, this is a really cool video. Okay, so lots of changes going on constantly. One of the major changes, as was mentioned in the video, was in how we look at the world. World views were shifting. And the Reformations, the Renaissance, the nations, the rise of the nation states, all that caused these changes. And one of the primary changes that happened is that people started to reject the church. Imagine that. So, they said, we don't know about this church as the authority when you're causing all these wars to happen, and I'm seeing other ways of doing things. So the philosophes, in French they are called the philosophes, the philosophers, this new way of thinking, the Enlightenment we call it now, enlightened people, that perhaps God is not as important as just simply learning how to think correctly. The world became increasingly rationalistic. It was about the head. It's about what I think, what I can reason out. It's about me and what I need and what I believe is right. Individualism, which, this still hangs around today. So nothing was true anymore until it could be completely proven, preferably through science. Does that sound familiar? Mm-hmm. So the only thing that's real is what our senses can show us, what we can work out. God, for many people, became a very different type of God. He became the God of the deists. So deism, what deism says basically is God set the world in motion and then God just lets it go to do its own thing. What we might call the clockwork God. So God is not involved on a daily basis or a continual basis with humankind. Okay. Deism.
That even permeated the Catholic Church.
Sure.
In the early 20th century, it still was there.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's still there
Absolutely.
now.
Absolutely. I definitely think it's still there now, yeah. Yeah, it's very much in our culture too, okay? As we will see, I want you to hang on to that word deism because when we talk about the founding of America, it's all over that. But we're talking about religious commitment now is very personal, very private. It's not a communal thing anymore. Okay? If you know the names Spinoza, Descartes, Locke, Hume, okay? These are the great philosophers, the great rationalists, the enlightened ones of these years.
I think, therefore I am.
Think, therefore I am, absolutely, yes. So religious thinking is just a small part of what's important in my life. Science is incredibly important. Again, what my senses can tell me, what I can observe. So Copernicus, Galileo, okay? Humanity is not at the center of creation because the earth is not at the center of creation. New astronomy taught them that the earth was rotating around the sun rather than the other way around. And this totally disrupted the story of creation of Genesis. And if Genesis can't be read literally, what does that do for the rest of our beliefs? So suddenly we've got scripture under attack, according to the church. Because this is how you were supposed to read scripture, they were saying at that time. Which I would say is not how the early church read it, but in those years, that's how they were reading it. Because actually, the church had always taught that reason and faith should go together, and they actually supported many of these early scientists. We have the church is withdrawing. The church is getting very, very nervous about what's going on in the world. And they see their people being drawn away by science, by these new ways of thinking, by perhaps new ways of looking at Scripture and reading Scripture, okay? By these new religious cults or faiths that are springing up all over. They're very nervous about what's going to happen. And then we also have something else brand new going on. The New World. North America, bless you. And lots of people who are leaving Europe, who are leaving the control and the influence of the church in Europe to go overseas. So heading to the New World from Europe are those who want new lifestyles, who are trying to escape what's happening in Europe, especially the religious dissidents, especially the Protestants, and then those who are so impoverished, either by war or the economic realities of Europe, that they want a new start. Nothing unusual here. We see this still today, right? Over and over again. I hope you can see why this was so important at that time. You know, that we have that church freedom, religious freedom, and that we allow religious pluralism. So we can say, how did the U.S. end up religiously pluralistic? You know, the reality of religious freedom as written in the Bill of Rights and in the history of the colonies. The separation of church and state. You know, establishmentarianism simply says that no one church will be the church of the nation. There will not be a theocracy. There will not be a church ruling the nation like we had in the Holy Roman Empire. Denominationalism. Okay, so we can say, for example, that the Church of Christ is a religious denomination. The Quakers are a religious denomination. The Universalists are a religious denomination. The Lutherans are a religious denomination. Right? But they're all Christian, right? So this idea of the marketplace, choices that can be made by Christians. Choose which one you want to be a part of, which is also part of the voluntary, we talk about the voluntary nature of church membership. You get to choose. You get to choose which you want to belong to. You want to say, Betty?
Or not. You could choose or not to choose.
Or not to choose, right. You can choose not to do that. Sure. Each of them were supposedly equal, okay, which I can tell you drove the Catholic Church leaders totally crazy to think all these little churches were equal to the Catholic Church. How dare you say that? Okay, well, and still today, correct? Yeah. Struck, I don't know if you all heard this, anyone who declares a monotheistic faith was okay with Penn.
Right.
Yeah,
And
very
they're
interesting.
Muslim and Jews, they're monotheistic.
One God.
Yeah.
They also said that our government had no choice but to accept all religions.
Yeah.
Because you can't single out then anyone in particular.
Right.
Yeah, but the irony of that is that Christianity became Christianity became so patriotic it made the United States even more powerful as a unity.
Which is what this fifth point says. This idea of patriotic piety, in a sense, to be an American became its own religion.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
So Americanism was its own faith, almost as important as your Christian faith. And the two became so tied together, it's still today very difficult to separate them. So Christianity, for Christianity in early America, pluralism. For the first time in the history of the world. I cannot emphasize enough how important that is. That all these faiths can live together, and they are not just tolerated, but they are permitted and almost encouraged. All right? The Puritans, however, became the symbol for American Christianity and in many ways for Americans in general. You know, this Calvinist Christianity, very almost austere, hard work. The city on the hill, this idea of the divinely appointed nature of us to spread out into the land. You know, that God has given us this country to do something great with it. Roger Williams, wonderful story about Roger Williams in Rhode Island and his push for religious tolerance and liberty. And Roger Williams later became associated with what denomination? You don't know? The Baptists. Yep, the Baptists. So, really important. Humanism, deism. Again, as Jean mentioned, many of the early American leaders, political leaders, were actually deists. They were fascinated by rationalistic philosophy. They were Christian in a sense, but again, it was this God who was quite removed from the world. Right? Washington, Jefferson, Madison, all kind of fall into that category. Right? Not Christian in the way we think of Christianity today. But from the beginning, there was a conflict between the Protestant and the Catholic churches here in North America. Right? So some of that tension that existed in Europe carried over into this country. 1634, they mentioned in the video, there was a small Catholic community in Maryland. 40 Catholic immigrants on the Ark and the Dove landed at St. Mary's City in Maryland. The Jesuits, a couple Jesuits came as missionary priests with them. However, just 6 years later, Puritans came down and kind of wiped them out, took their land, confiscated many of their goods. Right? By 1770, less than 7,000 Catholics in the U.S., a population of 2 million. That's a pretty small percentage. And only 16 priests. Right? So, very tiny. I'm going to skip the Methodists for right now. Although it's a fascinating story, I hope you'll read that about John Wesley, because the Methodists are extremely important when we're talking about Christianity in the U.S. Okay? There is a cartoon that I gave you, and I don't know how well you can see that, but you might notice there's this man here is protecting the people on the shore, and many of them kind of look like immigrants. They're not very wealthy-looking people. And can you see what this crocodile is wearing? Yeah, he's wearing a mitre. So he's protecting the people from the Pope, from the Catholics. The Papists, yeah. Yeah. So this is the kind of cartoon that was very prevalent, especially in the 19th century, okay, against Catholicism. And of course, there's the Capitol in the background. But we have people like John Carroll. The O'Carroll family came from Ireland, one of the earliest in the colonies. John Carroll's cousin, Charles, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was Catholic. John and Charles were called upon to interact with the French and ask for their help with the Revolutionary War. Okay. He was a Jesuit. He was trained in Europe because there was no place in the United States to get that kind of training. And he was the one who was kind of appointed to come up with a plan for the church after independence. Okay. So he was elected by his fellow priests, by his fellow Jesuits. 1% of the population was Catholic in 1785. The U.S. actually was considered a mission church until 1908.
Right.
So actually, here's a map. In 1790, there was one diocese in the U.S., and that was in Baltimore. Okay? In the eastern U.S. There is a diocese up here in Quebec. And then look at all of them down here in Mexico and Cuba. Okay? So they were here, but they're all down in Latin America or up in Canada. So what's important too at this time is for John Carroll and most American Catholics, the Pope is just simply this spiritual authority. Okay, someone you kind of look to and might listen to what he says, but very distant figure, not very active in the weekly or the annual life of any Catholic in the United States. There were no parishes, no schools, no dioceses yet. Okay, the one in Baltimore is still coming.
Do you think he understood the potential in this country?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But they didn't have the people, and they didn't have the helpers, right? So if you were a Catholic in the United States in 1780, if you participated in the sacraments once a year, that was probably a lot. Okay, they had traveling priests who would go on horseback. So you would pray in your home with your family or maybe with a neighbor if you had a Catholic neighbor, and that would, for the most part, be all that you had. Okay? Parents would teach their children in the home what their faith was about. If there was a church, and as churches were built, the people built the churches themselves. And then they would entice a priest to come and say Mass in that church. The people owned the church and the land on which the church sat. Okay? It's called trusteeship. That was very common in the early Catholic Church. So these parishes were quite independent. Okay? And one of the things that the early Catholic Church is going to struggle with is how do we, kind of like the early church itself, is how do we guide all this and how do we bring this together? So Carroll was elected the first bishop in 1788. We do have Carroll High School here in Dayton. That's who it's named for. He immediately said we need to focus on education both for priests as well as for students, for young people. Established the seminary in Baltimore. Georgetown, first Catholic college in the U.S., 1789. Okay. They had financial difficulties, imagine that. And so this is where the idea of the weekly collection came, to support the early church and in whatever churches had been established. Carroll was very much focused, because Catholics tended to be ostracized, on teaching his people, you need to be good citizens. You need to be good Americans. Right? We want to be accepted. We are not people who follow the Pope who's way over there. We are people who are here, who listen to what the president says, who listens to what our political leaders say here. Okay? And they brought in missionaries from elsewhere. A lot of French and Irish missionaries were invited in. Okay? And the church is going to start growing. So we have the French, once again, pushing things forward. And truly, we can say that the French Revolution was like the climax of the Enlightenment era. Okay? Rationality ruled, as you saw there.
So the fact that in North America we have now a constitution, they were aware of that and said they wanted the same thing.
Yes.
And that was the impetus.
Yes. We want a republic like you have a republic. Liberty, equality, brotherhood, fraternité. We are all equals. Yeah, they resented the wealthy, and very often the wealthy was the church. Yeah. But it's also part of this, everything's being questioned. All the tradition is being questioned and overturned. including religion. You know, this new way of looking at the world, the Industrial Revolution, science, all these things, exploration, all these things are coming together. Right, and so we call this the age of modernity. Modernity being this period when there's lots of questioning, there's the rejection of tradition, we're about the individual person, the freedom of the individual to do whatever, to be whomever, okay? Faith in science and progress, no matter what, progress is going to win. We're going to just keep on going. Okay? Away from agriculture, away from the Middle Ages, towards industry, towards the market economy, capitalism. This is when it starts to happen, the early 19th century. Industrialization, urbanization. Right? And any questions on that? Now, what does that have to do with the church? Well, that's what the church wants to know.
It's very much in opposition to what the church has been doing
Yeah.
for centuries.
Absolutely, very much in opposition. You know, there's not the respect for the authority of any kind anymore, especially religious authority. So that's why Napoleon can walk in and walk out with the Pope. Okay?
He didn't have his guards then? Didn't have the, I guess not.
No, didn't need them. All right? So the popes became very much against what they would call liberal Catholicism. Now, don't think of liberal Catholicism like we call liberal today. In this case, what liberal Catholicism referred to was about humanism, right? And about the person, and about this equality of people, okay? And about progress. And the church really struggled with that. What do we make of this? We don't want revolutions anymore, but we're not sure what the value of history or science is for us. Okay? Liberal Christians wanted the church to move forward. They wanted them to get out from behind the walls and embrace what was happening in the world. To embrace republicanism and to see that this might be good. But the church responded by stepping back and saying, no, we have this authority, we have this doctrine, and that's the truth. Okay? And look at everything else with suspicion. And as that one historian said, that's going to go on for a very long period of time, about 150 years, until Vatican II. When finally the church decides to let some of the walls down. Right? So this is the start of it. Now, in the U.S., this is of course going on, and the church really doesn't know what to do with the United States, because it is something totally new. Right? They still don't, that's right. Much immigration going on in the U.S., huge numbers of people starting to come in. By 1808, there's 4 dioceses in the United States. After 1815, many more, especially Germans and Irish, are going to start immigrating. More clergy is needed, first of all. More churches are needed. What they discovered was that the common schools were not friendly to Catholics, because the common schools were very Christian-based, they were very Protestant-based. And they wanted the students, for example, to read from the King James Bible. And there was a lot of conflict over the fact that the parents didn't want their kids reading from the King James Bible. That wasn't the Catholic Bible. Okay? There were riots over this. Riots, fires, murders. But by 1810, we do have more dioceses in the colonies. There's 4, including one, you will notice the first one west of the Alleghenies, down in Kentucky, in Bardstown. Bardstown was our diocese originally. Okay. There's also one down in New Orleans, all right, which was not yet part of the United States. Okay. Here's some numbers of people. 2 million Irish immigrants between 1820 and 1860. Probably some of your ancestors were among that. And look at how many Germans. Okay? So lots of European immigrants. So the Diocese of Cincinnati was originally part of Bardstown. As this part of Ohio continued to increase in population, Fenwick became, actually, well, they might be there. Fenwick became the first bishop in 1821. He was a Dominican. That's a picture of him over there. Fenwick High School, some of you know about Fenwick High School. 1850, Cincinnati. Cincinnati became an archdiocese. It now includes 19 counties and about 500,000 Catholics. The Catholic Telegraph is the oldest continuously published Catholic newspaper in the U.S., which is something to be proud of, I guess. So by 1840, you can see the number of archdioceses has definitely increased, all the way out to Wisconsin, Iowa, and there's a couple out in California now too. Okay. But anti-Catholicism was still very real, especially in the 1840s, 1850s, as the immigration numbers continued to go up. Some of you may remember the Know Nothings. You heard about them in American history. This was actually a political party whose whole point was they were against immigration and they were against Catholics. But that could very well be. So there was more rioting. Churches were burned, schools were burned, convents were burned. They tried to deny Catholic citizenship. They said that they could not be truly American citizens. Okay? Tried to restrict property ownership. Okay. There were stories like this one, the awful disclosures of Maria Monk, that were supposedly true stories about what happened in convents. But as a result of all of this, the church in America decided that a separate school system for Catholic students was very necessary. So this is when we start to see the real push for Catholic schools in the 1850s. And there was some discussion even back then, can we get state aid for Catholic schools? And they said no. There were some experiments at that time. The first plenary council of the bishops, the first time the bishops all got together, was 1852, 31 bishops in Baltimore. Purcell, who was our bishop then, Purcell was there at this council. And what they said is you need to have a seminary in each place, in each diocese. You need to have, each church should have a school. And be loyal to the Pope. Be loyal to the Pope. Because, remember at the end of that video there, they're talking about how the Pope's ghost came back up. Okay? What's going to happen is that in Europe, after Napoleon, there is a push in Italy for the unification of the nation of Italy. And there's some battles that go on there. And this is a map of Italy in 1796. Look at this. These are what we call the Papal States. So that is land that the Pope owned. Smack dab, and they had owned this for 1,000 years. Actually, this is very condensed from what they used to own. Okay? Smack dab in the middle of Italy. But we wanted to unite all of this. So that land is going to be forcibly taken from the papacy, and all they end up with is Vatican City. Okay? So in the 1850s, the Pope loses the Papal States. As a result, and the thinking was, if you don't have land, you don't have a standing army, where's your power? Right? This is hard for us to imagine, that they thought that the Pope had to have these things But where is the power? Okay. Well, the Pope says, well, the power is in that I can create doctrine. So this is when the dogma of the Immaculate Conception was promulgated, 1854. And in part, that was done to stress the authority of the Pope. I can declare new dogmas. Okay. Also, this is the time when the whole question of papal infallibility starts to come up. That when the Pope sits on the throne of Peter and speaks on issues of morals and ethics and dogma, that is infallible. He is correct. Okay? More emphasis on papal authority, what we call ultramontanism, looking over the mountains to the Pope for leadership and for guidance, became extremely important in Europe and starts to spill over into the United States. So that's why at this plenary council, we have the Archbishop saying to the other bishops, now what is the Pope saying? Okay, pay attention to the Pope. In 1864, in another show of papal authority, the Pope publishes something called the Syllabus of Errors that delineates 80 errors of the modern world, of modernity, including things like the idea of individualism and being important in that we have our individual conscience and we can decide what to think, what to believe. Okay? But the world is shocked at this because it seems like a step backwards, okay? A step back into medievalism. Okay? But there is this reassertion of papal authority. And, well, to a certain extent it worked, but it also started to make people think, you know, what is going on with the papacy? What's going on with the Catholic Church? And we're going to come back to this next week and talk about this a little bit more, but I did want to show you this. So you have this cartoon of the monk in the cave, basically in his cell, with all these skulls laying around, you know, and the medieval quill and manuscripts, ink, and so on.
But he's a handsome dude.
So the church going backwards is how they saw things happening. When in the rest of the U.S., all kinds of new religious movements are going on. Okay, we're going to start here next week and talk about what did this mean for the individual person in the Catholic Church in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, prior to Vatican II, and how and why did things change? Okay? And maybe a little bit where it might go too. So I want you to think about that. Why don't we say an Our Father before we go? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.